This episode is brought to you by Principles. Ray Dalio, legendary investor and New York Times best-selling author, wants to pass along his understanding of how countries go broke, because he believes the U.S. budget and debt situation needs to be addressed. To give you that knowledge, he has put the draft of his book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, online for free. It's available now at economicprinciples.org.
It's The Other Side of Midnight with Frank Morano.
I am thrilled to be joined by George Beebe. George Beebe is one of the most experienced people when it comes to foreign policy that I've ever had the opportunity to talk to. He is currently the director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute, a think tank I think does great work. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, a diplomat, a policy advisor, including as director of the CIA's Russia analysis. He wrote a very interesting book, essentially warning about where we are right now when it comes to U.S.-Russia relations. And I had wanted to talk with George anyway, because I read some of his recent work and had been very impressed. But then this news of this Trump shooting or attempted assassination comes out yesterday, and it turns out this guy was obsessed, meaning the shooter, with Ukraine. And when I listened to the interview that he did with Newsweek in 2022, it was clear to me that he bought this wholesale, this good versus evil, Putin is Hitler narrative that we hear through 90% of the corporate media. And I thought it was even more important to have somebody like George Beebe on to give the perspective that maybe there is some nuance here. Maybe you shouldn't just assume someone is Hitler because the media says they're Hitler. So very pleased to welcome back to the program the director of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute, George Beebe. George, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for getting up early for us.
Thanks, Frank.
All right, let's begin. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to comment on this Trump assassination attempt itself, but I'm sure you've heard the rhetoric that this fella was repeating, which was very similar to what a lot of the mainstream news media has been saying. Do you find the media irresponsible in how they've covered this conflict because they've covered it in such absolutist terms?
Well, yeah, actually, I do. I think, and it's not just how they're covering the Ukraine issue. I think our media in general has transformed over the past several decades. And I think it's really departed from an effort to try to be neutral and objective about covering news. It's one thing to offer opinions in editorial pages. It's quite another to inject them into news coverage itself. And that's become too common. And that includes on this issue of Ukraine. And to some degree, I think we've overly politicized foreign policy issues, turned them into domestic political issues. And when you do that, you're not able to look at those foreign policy issues from a national interest point of view. You're looking at it from a narrowly political partisan point of view, and that usually doesn't turn into a formula for success. So I think we need to move away from politicizing these issues in a partisan way in this country and start looking at this from a national interest point of view. What policies make Americans safer? What make them more prosperous? What brings stability to the world in general? And there's been too little discussion about those issues, I think, in our media.
So give folks an understanding of the kind of thing that you're talking about. How can you have foreign policy which is made ultimately by politicians or bureaucrats hired by politicians, and politicians run in elections? How can you have foreign policy without politics?
Well, there is politics, and then there's naked partisanship, and there's a difference. And I think people that are interested in this question ought to go back and look at presidential debates from 30, 40 years ago and what they were like. recognizing that the scope for disagreement was relatively narrow. People were talking about how to achieve goals that they all agreed on, and there were differences about tactics, differences about emphasis. But there was broad agreement about the goals that we ought to be pursuing. And we've really departed from that. I think we've now cast these issues in very apocalyptic terms. That democracy itself, the existence of the United States itself, is at stake. And unfortunately, we've gotten ourselves in a situation where, partly as a result of that, we are on the brink of direct war with the world's largest nuclear power. And a lot of people convinced that we ought to simply ignore that danger and proceed full speed ahead, believing that the Russians would never resort to the use of nuclear weapons, and we can and should do anything in order to defeat the Russians strategically. And I think that's a very dangerous position for us to be in.
Just a couple days ago, on Friday, you published a really interesting column, headline, "Not enough long-range missiles to make a difference for Ukraine, but letting Kyiv strike deep into Russia could lead us right into war." Take us through this. Why are the long-range missiles that we're giving them not going to be what they need to win this war? And what can we give the Ukrainians, if we wanted to, that would be enough for them to win this war?
Well, this has become a war of attrition, not surprisingly. The Ukrainians are greatly outmanned by the Russians. The Russians have probably 5 times the population that Ukraine does. They have much, much more productive military industry. The Russians have really put their economy on a war footing, and they are cranking out artillery pieces and missiles and other forms of weaponry at a rapid pace. And the Ukrainians can't keep up. They just don't have the capacity. And neither does the United States and Europe. We're not able to produce weaponry and artillery shells and missiles at the pace that the Ukrainians need them to stay in this war. And unless we put our own soldiers in the line of fire, we can't change the imbalance in the size of the military that Ukraine can put on the battlefield. So what the United States and Europe are tempted to do under these circumstances is simply escalate the lethality of what Ukraine can use to strike into Russia itself, hoping that might change this situation. When in fact, I think what that's likely to do is cause the Russians to say, hey, we have to draw a line somewhere. If we don't respond when NATO is directly assisting long-range strikes on Russian territory with its satellite reconnaissance data, its targeting information, helping the Ukrainians pick out targets in Russia, the danger then will be that NATO will believe it can put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and Russia will have no choice but to be at war with the United States. And they don't want to do that. So I think we're reaching a point very rapidly where the Russians feel they have got to act, or the consequences of inaction will be catastrophic for them. So we're in a very difficult situation right now. Now, what does the Ukrainian military need? They really need air defense forces. They need a lot of Patriot batteries and other kinds of air defense systems to minimize Russia's ability to strike deep into Ukraine. The problem there is we don't have them. We don't have enough air defense systems to go around. And under these circumstances, and you could see this coming for years, actually, you need to actually seriously consider negotiating a compromise settlement to this war. And that's the one thing that we don't seem willing to contemplate under these circumstances. So if you're not going to contemplate that, you're either going to escalate into a direct clash with Russia, or Ukraine is going to collapse.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track. And ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
Nurses, are you tired of spending weeks or even months finding the perfect job that matches your specialty with your ideal shift and salary? LinkedIn has improved your job search experience. Search by specialty, the shift you want to work, and the salary you want to make. Go to linkedin.com/nurses and begin searching today. That's linkedin.com/nurses.
Note, side effects may include less time finding the perfect job, working a shift that you love with a salary that can take you to St. Thomas, Jamaica, and continuous smiling because of how simple this process was.
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
Home means something different to everyone. But with Rocket Mortgage, home can mean even more. It can mean a college education, taming your high-interest debt, even a renovation. We've made it easier than ever to use your home equity. That home you worked so hard for, now it can work hard for you. Call 800-4ROCKET or visit rocket.com to find out more.
Rocket Mortgage, LLC. Licensed in all 50 states. NMLSConsumerAccess.org, number 3030.
Well, that's certainly disconcerting. But as far as the American role in supplying weapons to Ukraine, this has been described as a proxy war between the United States and Russia. What you deal with in your book and what you've talked about in a lot of your commentaries is how this could actually escalate into a hot war. How would that work exactly on a practical level? It would just the supplying of weapons to Ukraine be enough for the Russians to be ticked off at us to try and take aim at some American assets? Or are you thinking that there would be a deployment of American troops to Eastern Europe?
Well, I think the important thing in this is to recognize that neither side actually wants to get into a direct shooting war, neither the United States nor Russia. I think we both realize that could quite quickly escalate into a nuclear clash, and nobody would come out of that as a winner. We'd all be losers. Now, you then say, well, if they don't want that, then how could that happen nonetheless? And that's the problem, because the Russians are in a situation right now where they feel like no matter what they do, we're not getting the message that we're getting too deeply involved in this directly. We're doing it incrementally. It's sort of like a boiled frog problem, right? You slowly raise the temperature, and after a while you realize, oh my gosh, the frog is boiling. And that's what the Russians worry about. We keep continuing to probe to see where Russia's red line is. What's the point at which they might retaliate with some sort of direct strike on Western assets? And the Russians realize once they do that, they could be in an escalatory spiral toward a military clash with us. But the farther we push them, we're now talking about using Americans in the targeting and the execution of strikes where, yes, the Ukrainians might be piloting the aircraft that fire the missiles, but everything else about that depends on American or European involvement. And the Russians are thinking, I believe, hey, if we don't do something about that, if we don't retaliate in a way that really sends a clear message to us, hey, you've crossed a line, we're just going to keep pushing even farther. And then you might wind up with something that would be very damaging to Russian security. What if, Americans were on the ground in Ukraine actually firing missiles into Russia. For the Russians, that is not at all unimaginable. And they would have to do something about that, strike those sites, and now you're potentially in a war with the United States. And I think the Russians don't want to have to face that kind of situation. So they want to deter us from doing that. And that means they need to do something sooner rather than later, because after the fact, their options are bad. Now, then you have to ask, okay, they do, let's say they strike an American satellite and send a real message, hey, enough is enough. What do we do?
Right.
The pressures in Washington to do something in response would be enormous. We're not simply going to sit there and say, oh, well, we crossed a line, shouldn't have done that, let's stop. We are going to retaliate. Now you're in an escalatory spiral, and that becomes very emotional. And you're doing this in the context of a presidential election, which, of course, as we mentioned earlier, is highly emotional,
right,
highly polarized. And you're not then in a sort of a rational actor model where you'd say, hey, everybody should realize this is a bad thing, we shouldn't go there. Your actions start getting impelled by politics and emotions and raw hatred, and you're not talking to each other. The United States and Russia are not communicating about how to avoid all of this. So this is a precarious situation, and it could get out of hand, and that's the problem we're in.
Lastly, George, and I have to break in a minute, but I did want to reiterate this aspect of it. I understand your description of the possible problems going forward, but going back to the black and white nature of this conflict, the good versus evil nature of this conflict, which is how people like Joe Biden, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Kevin McCarthy have all characterized it in that way, and obviously Zelensky himself. There is a feeling that, Ukraine was just minding its own business, going about its own way. And then Vladimir Putin just woke up one morning and said, hey, I'd like to have a little bit of eastern Ukraine. I'm going to go and invade it without any sort of reason to do so. Can you briefly explain why that black and white, good versus evil narrative is inaccurate, or at least in need of more nuance?
Well, this problem has been brewing for decades, and the Russians had been, I think, very clearly warning that if Ukraine were pulled into a military alliance with the United States through NATO, or if the United States were to put significant military forces on the ground in Ukraine, even if Ukraine were not in the NATO alliance, that would pose a severe military threat to Russia. And they wanted to make sure that did not happen. And they urged us over the course of many, many years to address this situation and reach some sort of understanding that Ukraine would be militarily neutral, not allied to the United States or NATO. And we refused to talk about this. I think to this day we refuse to talk about that issue with the Russians. Now, I'm not blaming the United States solely for this situation, but it's a lot more complicated than a mere land grab. And that's one of the failures of the media on all of this, because very shortly after this full-scale invasion of February 2022, it was almost required, it seemed, that if Western media were covering this, they had to use that adjective, unprovoked, in front of the word invasion from Russia. Now, they did this, I think, with very little thought, very little examination of the context of all this and what had led to this over the course of a few decades. So their coverage became very black and white. And I think that was intentional. They wanted to rule out any discussion that there may have been any nuance or complexity behind all of this. And that's a problem because if you don't understand these bigger issues, the context, the history, the nuance, the complexity, then you're not going to have a very easy time finding a solution to all of this.
George Beebe, I will. We will end it there. I very much appreciate you getting up early for us and chatting with us about such a tough situation at such a tough time. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
George Beebe, he is with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft.